I'm Tim Harness, and I want to tell you about the association between Twickenham, which is where I live in southwest London, and the French royal family. This association lasted over 100 years, and at one time Twickenham was home to the last King of the French. Its location on the river between London and Hampton Court made Twickenham a popular place for the gentry of the 18th and 19th centuries. It was close to London, but the air was clean and the landscape was beautiful, and it attracted nobility, writers and artists such as J.M.W. Turner, whose house still stands close to the River Thames. In 1800, three brothers arrived in Twickenham as refugees from France. Those brothers were members of the Bourbon family, the royal family of France. And those refugees were Louis Philippe and his brothers Antoine and Louis Charles. They all had grand titles: the Duc d'Orléans, the Duc de Montpensier and the Comte de Beaujolais, but were forced to live in much more humble circumstances than they were brought up to. The eldest brother would eventually become King Louis Philippe I and rule France from 1830 until the French Revolution of 1848. Louis Philippe was born in 1773 and raised in the Palais Royal in Paris. He belonged to a junior branch of the Bourbon family. This is where the story gets slightly confusing because there are multiple Louis Philippes. Louis Philippe in this story became king of the French. His father was also known as Louis Philippe, and his father was also Louis Philippe, and incidentally also known as Louis the Fat, for obvious reasons. Louis Philippe III had very wealthy and privileged parents. His mother was an extremely rich heiress, descended from King Louis XIV. His father was a liberal, enlightened aristocrat who supported the ideals of the 1789 revolution and changed his name to Louis Égalité. In 1789, the French Revolution shook up the whole of Europe profoundly, and young Louis Philippe joined the Republican Army. He was the hereditary colonel of the Charter Dragoons, and in 1791, at the age of 18, he was ordered to join his regiment. Louis Philippe saw action in several battles between revolutionary France and the Habsburgs, who ruled Austrian Empire. He was promoted to lieutenant general, but was implicated in a plot by General Dumouriez to ally with the Austrians and march on Paris. He was forced to flee to Switzerland, but his father and two younger brothers were arrested and interned in the formidable Fort Saint-Jean in Marseille. Louis Égalité was tried before the Revolution Tribunal and was guillotined on the 6th November 1792. Unable to return to France, Louis Philippe travelled extensively in Europe and then the United States, where he met up with his brothers, Louis Charles and Antoine, who had been released from jail in Marseille and exiled. They eventually went to Nova Scotia in Canada, which was a British territory where they were received by the Duke of Kent, the fifth son of George III and later father of Queen Victoria. Louis Philippe struck up a long-lasting friendship with the British royal, which was to prove very useful in later years. In January 1800, the brothers arrived in Twickenham, where Louis Philippe was to stay for the next 15 years. They lived quietly in Highshot House in Crown Road in Twickenham for much of the next 7 years, supported by Secret Service funds. They made friends locally with the innkeeper of the Crown Inn in Richmond Road and the Austrian ambassador, Count Starenburg, who was then living in York House. During these years, Louis Philippe taught mathematics and geography at the Great Ealing School, which was reckoned in the 19th century heyday to be the best private school in England. His younger brothers Antoine Philippe and Louis Charles both contracted tuberculosis in prison in Marseille, from which they never recovered. In 1807, Antoine's condition worsened. Louis Philippe was taking him to Devon for the fresh air, but 12 miles from Twickenham they stopped at an inn at Salt Hill near Windsor, and Antoine died there. Louis Charles travelled to Malta to try to improve his health, but he died in Valletta, aged just 28, in 1808. In 1809, Louis Philippe married Princess Maria Amalia of Naples and Sicily. The marriage was considered a bit controversial at the time because she was the niece of Marie Antoinette, who had been guillotined by the revolutionary government that Louis Philippe had fought for. With the fall of the Emperor Napoleon in 1814, Louis Philippe and his growing family returned to France, only to leave again when Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to Paris in March 1815. Louis came to his senses and his family returned back again to Twickenham, and he leased a large riverside house, which then became known as Orleans House. This is Orleans House, where Louis Philippe lived with his family from 1815 to 1817. His daughter was born here and was christened at the nearby St Mary's Church. It is now home to Richmond Borough's art collection. He stayed in Orleans House until 1817, when he returned to France, where the Bourbon monarchy had been restored under his cousin Louis XVIII. He was succeeded by his brother Charles X, but his reactionary rule brought about another revolution in France in July 1830. Louis Philippe was seen as a safe pair of hands and was persuaded to accept the crown and liberalise the constitution. He promoted friendship with Great Britain and admired the British form of constitutional monarchy. He visited Twickenham once again on a state visit in October 1844. At first he was much loved and called the citizen king and the bourgeois monarch, but his popularity suffered as his government was perceived as increasingly conservative and monarchical. In 1848, French troops fired on demonstrators, which set off another revolution and caused Louis Philippe to flee to England in a cab under the name of Mr. Smith. Louis Philippe returned here to the crown in 1848 after he had lost his throne. The innkeeper remarks that he had kept the crown. Louis Philippe said, "Well, that's more than I have managed to do." Queen Victoria lent him Claremont House in Esher, and the last king of the French died there in 1851. In the 1860s, 3 of Louis Philippe's sons lived in or around Twickenham, and this is where I ruined the pronunciation of those French titles. The Duc d'Aumale lived at Orleans House, Duc de Nemours lived at Bussy House, and the Prince de Joinville lived at Lebanon Park. A great-grandson of King Louis Philippe was born at York House in 1869. His name was Louis Philippe Robert, and he was the claimant to the French throne and was known to monarchists as Philippe VIII. He redecorated the house extensively, so it ended up looking like a French chateau. You can still see a French fleur-de-lis on a plaque on the wall. As part of his renovation of York House, he built a boathouse on the river embankment, which now belongs to Twickenham Yacht Club. He built a large extension now known as Clarendon Hall for his fencing practice. I go to it every year for Twickenham Beer Festival. After an unsuccessful military career, this Louis Philippe died of pneumonia in Palermo in Sicily in 1926. Philippe's sister, Marie Amélie, married into the Portuguese royal family and became Queen of Portugal. Her husband and eldest son were both assassinated in 1908, and her younger son, Manuel, then became King of Portugal himself. There was a revolution in 1910, and she fled Portugal with King Manuel back to her childhood home in Twickenham. Manuel lived in Fulwell Park in Twickenham until his death there in 1932. I hope you've enjoyed this story about the French royal family. You can see there's much more to Twickenham than a match at the stadium and a pint at the cabbage patch. Thank you for joining me.